Chapter 13. Step 1. We admitted that we were powerless over substances or behavior, that our lives had become unmanageable. The first step is the beginning foundation of putting the puzzle of our lives back together again. Step 1 is the only step that most 12-step programs have changed or altered in wording, enabled to focus on the addiction that they primarily cover. We begin by breaking down the two characteristics identified in the first step, being powerlessness and unmanageability. We will examine what addictions filled in our lives to create powerlessness. This understanding will help break the misconceptions that we may have had that addiction is a moral deficiency. By getting clear information on how addictions build in our lives, we can then better understand how to halt them. One factor that complicates our ability to move on from addictions is the temporary gratification or release we get, which is normally not present in our lives. When we think about the gratification is that a person receives from addiction, it can be different for different people. Some see the benefit of an uplifting feeling of invincibility, be all you can be. Another may be to numb them of conflict, stress, or pain. To another, a way to release the buildup of emotions. This perceived sense of reward fuels a continued obsession with addiction. It sounds simple, but the process of getting our emotional, social, and spiritual needs met from our addiction is usually a gradual process for most of us. As we indulge in the use of substances or behavior to give us this reward, we expend resources that we normally would have used in our relationships for the benefit of getting high. I no longer have to actively work on myself to feel good. I can synthetically build that with alcohol and drugs or other compulsive behaviors. When my drive to use a substance triggers a loss of control in my behavior and I hurt someone, instead of admitting it, I justify my actions. This is because to set things right would take away the possibility of the reward being available. Usually, in weaving through our life experience, we gain some sense of confidence or a sense of reward in accomplishing goals. The byproduct of that good feeling is similar to the reward we may get when we get high from our addiction. We begin to expend the time and resources that we used in our personal responsibilities for the quick fix we get from the use of substances or addictive behavior. The benefit we get from a substance replaces the benefit we receive from sharing our feelings with others. As time goes on, we rely on the substance or behavior to change how we feel. We turn to the substance or behavior to get a similar reward or relief, however temporary. We then begin to rely on the substance or behavior to change how we feel, because it seems to be a more reliable way than relationships to get that reward. In our addiction, the substance becomes our main source for changing any of our emotions. This reliance on a substance to change how we feel rather than our relationships with others takes a toll on our emotional, physical, and spiritual condition. The first step brings into clarity the impact this relationship with addiction has had on our lives. This is usually demonstrated by our impulsive abuse of the substance or behavior. Most addicts and chemically dependent people have a varied pattern of loss of control. Some appear to have a total loss of control in their substance abuse, which is late-stage addiction. More common are periodic losses of control that cause negative consequences in people's lives. Admitting we have a loss of control is admitting powerlessness. These patterns of loss of control need to be identified on how they apply to our own lives. When people look at the first step, which states, admits that they are powerless over the substance or behavior, most will interpret powerlessness as weakness or like a child's sense of being helpless. An adult's perception of powerlessness, however, could be defined as a limitation the person has developed in his or her own life. Adults, even though they have a sense of powerlessness, can recognize what the limitation is and find resources to work around the problem. Often, however, our pride gets in the way of looking at the issue or issues of limitation in our lives. We try every conceivable alternative until we are left with the one set of circumstances that will correct the problem. We may switch to another substance or switch from hard alcohol to wine. We may move to another location. We may pick a new set of friends. We tried to do everything but stop the use of the substance or compulsive behavior. This unmanageability can be identified as external and internal consequences which may have occurred directly as a result of our loss of control in the substance or behavioral addiction. The first part of unmanageability is external consequences, which are self-evident. Now, if we are in a state of avoidance and not willing to admit to powerlessness, then there will be additional external consequences. This causes unmanageability in our lives. If we took someone who was diabetic and he was not willing to recognize that he had a problem with his disease and didn't do anything to change his diet, what would happen? He would get progressively worse, right? There is personal loss and pain as a result of control. As addictions progress in our lives, the amount of consequences also grow. A gentleman at a 12-step meeting reported that the worst consequence he had in his life was being incarcerated for a DUI and having his wife pick him up at the county jail. I thought to myself, that's the worst consequence? I've spilt more than he drank. But then he went on to say that when his wife arrived, he could see that in her eyes he had become a stranger to her. When the children greeted him back at home, he could tell that they were looking into his eyes to see if he was intoxicated or not. He could tell that they were apprehensive and did not know what to expect from his situation. After hearing this man's story and watching his experience in coming into recovery, it gave me new insight. I saw that he wasn't a lightweight. He was a genius in doing something about his problem before it took away the most precious thing he had in his life, his family. Being a chronic disease, addiction is also progressive. They may come on fast or gradual, but it's inevitable that they will get worse. We have seen the insanity of addiction in other people's lives, vowing to never let that happen to us. But then it did. I have seen many people struggle with their patterns of powerlessness in their lives, from those of the beginning stages of alcoholism and addiction to those of the latest stages. I was working with a man named Jack at a homeless shelter. He remained abstinent for 9 months and then relapsed. For the next 7 years he was homeless, sometimes staying on couches and other times sleeping outside. He reported not being able to stay at the local shelter because they required him to be sober. The changing point occurred when his significant other, who was also an alcoholic, and he were living in a tent, and she died from exposure of the elements in the middle of winter. It wasn't until he was hospitalized for a month due to serious injury that he was able to get sober. He has been able to build a program of recovery with strong involvement with 12-step meetings and counseling. He is volunteering at a homeless shelter providing support to others, especially during critical weather conditions. Usually we don't want to admit to that pattern of powerlessness because the recognition is going to come with a stigma of being an alcoholic or an addict. This prevents us from moving beyond the problem. Alcoholism and addiction, being a chronic illness, are considered incurable because they only can go into remission. Thus, we feel a sense of futility and the disease is never truly over. Since we interpret our problems as unique from others, we continue with that sense of isolation that occurred during our addiction. Admission to an addiction helps the person break through the confinement of their denial. To get to a destination that I need to go, I need to clarify where I am starting from. Hitting bottom is the usual terminology for acceptance of an addiction. We come to a moment of clarity where we can see the chaos that occurred in our addiction was necessary to seek help. This definitive state of awareness occurs based on the individual's life experience. Some have more to lose than others. When I was in a halfway house, I had the same sobriety date as another friend who also lived in the recovery house. Pete and I celebrated our recovery birthdays at a 12-step meeting where we got our sobriety chip and a birthday cake. After 2 years sober, Pete went out one more time and drank, getting into a car accident that left him paralyzed from the neck down. I had heard from friends that he had come back into recovery, but I couldn't face him because I thought his physical injuries were more than I could bear. However, I ran into him at a recovery event a year later, and he looked at me and said, "I know why you haven't come to see me." He said, "I want you to know that the accident opened my eyes so I could gain what the program of recovery could truly be for me." I was deeply humbled. We sometimes think that this is the worst bottom that could occur in our lives, when perhaps it's all we could endure. The addict will show obsessive compulsion as a driving force as it becomes embedded in their personality. If an addict is given a psychological profile test such as the MMPI, Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, in most cases it will show positive for obsessive-compulsive personality. Once a person develops a personality trait such as this as an adult, it remains with us the rest of our adult lives. To the addict, it simply means we work hard and play hard. We don't know how to establish limits for ourselves. This does not mean that we don't get better. It simply is an adjustment. Addicts are driven people, and using the resources of the compulsive personality becomes a driving force for recovery to begin. We simply are applying purpose and direction to the energy we already have. Often we are our own worst critics and our own biggest obstacle in dealing with the problem in our lives. Once we get through the barrier of self and start building relationships with others who can help us find a solution, things get better. One of the purposes of the first step is to bring the problems that have occurred because of our addiction to the surface. Embarrassment is an emotion that often prevents us from sharing our problems with others. When a person gets a DUI and their name is printed in the paper, they experience that embarrassment and avoid talking about what caused it. When there's a series of consequences as a result of abuse, it triggers a feeling of shame, which only increases the sensitivity to how others perceive us. Shame is an internalized emotion that tells us our value has lessened, that because of our actions we're not enough, so we hide. This avoidance of involvement with others keeps us from talking about the things that trigger negative feelings about ourselves, but it impedes any progress. Denial becomes a prison holding us locked behind its bars. We denied having a problem in spite of all the evidence to the contrary. We lied to ourselves, believing that the reason for our problems was not our own doing. Riding the wave of denial kept our temporary solution to our problem available to us, our addiction. All of our survival defenses hold us back from confronting an addiction. The confronting of our lifestyle surrounding our addiction ends that lifestyle and begins another. Although there may be intense pain surrounding an addiction, it still is a lifestyle that the person has become accustomed to. To begin a new journey without addiction is new territory. The brain functioning process and changing our thinking patterns can begin to take root in about a 90-day period of time. 12-step programs suggest for in the beginning of recovery to attend 90 meetings in 90 days. The premise of the 12 steps is to integrate back into healthy relationships with others through the term we, the beginning of the first step. This concept of being part of a mutual effort of a group of people is the beginning of regaining an equal concept of self in relationships with others. This involvement takes the person out of potential sabotaging elements of their lifestyle. The term hitting bottom is well recognized as a person coming to terms with their alcoholism or addictions. Starting to write out a first step brings these issues to the surface. Often when beginning recovery and starting to share our first step with others, we will have a burden of negative emotion that have built up. When we are processing these emotions which we have held in for so long, we respond with anger, guilt, shame, and other negative emotions. The task at hand is to come to terms with our own reflection that has been hidden from view of others and ourselves. This experience echoes to us how empty the experience of addiction has been. This moment of clarity is the fire that drives the recovering addict. Simply saying your name and that you're an alcoholic or an addict at a 12-step meeting can be a large step towards accepting the first step. When a person shares this about themselves at a meeting, their peers recognize them as a colleague in recovery. This opens the door for rebuilding relationships with peers, almost like a rite of passage. Often I've heard people say at meetings that this is the most expensive club that they ever belonged to, because of the financial pain and suffering it costs them to get there. The more we share about our addiction at a meeting, the more aware we become of our problem. Meetings on the first step in which the group is discussing give us an opportunity to gain more of the realization of how this step pertains to us. The first step brings these circumstances to the surface by writing about them and sharing them with others. By doing so, denial becomes replaced with awareness, as it has impeded our vision. Yes, it brings to the surface a lot of pain that we have kept buried beneath the surface. By exposing it to light, it transforms into personal motivation to sustain recovery. We experience a moment of clarity which brings us one step further into recovery. So if we're saying pain is a motivator for change, then the amount of personal pain experienced to make the change needs to be determined by the individual. Writing out and sharing our first step is a powerful experience which ignites motivation and inspiration to halt an addiction. It is necessary for us to acknowledge where we have been in order to chart a new course of action. This is the first step to recovery from addiction. Writing out our patterns of powerlessness is the first part of the first step. Using a first step guide to write out our self-assessment is recommended to take a thorough view of this step. It is looking at the specific actions, which for us demonstrate patterns of loss of control in our use of the substance or compulsive behavior. Our intention was to go out for a few hours to a bar with friends, which turns out to be a whole day. We switched from one addiction to another or an addictive behavior such as gambling, and ended up with our lives going out of control again. We swore we would never drink and drive again and got another DUI. We made a commitment to stop our substance or addictive behavior to loved ones and hid our use to avoid their anger. The second part of the first step is unmanageability due to our addictions. We continue to write on the circumstances of our personal actions which demonstrate this unmanageability. There are two areas that we need to look at. The first is the external unmanageability and what impact it had on our lives. Legal, family problems, loss of relationships, financial, loss of jobs, emotional and physical consequences, and sexuality. In our disease of dependency, our actions or lack of actions had a devastating effect on ourselves, family, and those who have shared our lives. The second part of unmanageability does not come from external consequences, but from internal motivators that kept our addictions thriving. These patterns are identified as victim, controller, and isolator patterns. They are the part of the main frame of work known as character defects, which we will be clearing up through working the steps. There were certain core beliefs that supported us to continue to defend our actions. An example being a sense of self-entitlement, thinking that we deserve this in spite of the cost, or that we deserve no better. This exaggerated sense of esteem is called grandiosity. The lack of esteem is called worthlessness. These patterns in relationships place us at arm's length. The core beliefs that we had while in our addiction fed our character defects. We used these character defects to continue to create a self-fulfilling prophecy that change was impossible or change wasn't necessary at all. It is important for us to understand with clarity that these patterns of thought influenced or controlled our actions. Our character defects are built out of fear for survival or a continuation of how we were raised. We use what resources we have to establish a sense of functionality for ourselves. For instance, in the controller role, we may have felt deserving and self-entitlement in our abuse of substances or other addictive behaviors. This creates a false self-image that our rights and needs are more important than others. We may have blamed others or past events for our actions, keeping us locked into addictions. An individual in the victim role feels imprisoned. Victim patterns are created either by being in a relationship with a controller, locked behind their high expectations for themselves, or due to losses, mental illness, trauma, chronic pain. Their focus is that they're not enough in their present circumstances and lack the ability to change. The person in the isolating hidden role is a master of deception. Often I've heard people describe for their reason for this was either feeling self-entitlement and didn't need to change, or feeling not enough to change. All of these behaviors keep the person isolated from others so they don't need to interfere with their practice of their addictions. This internal justification for our actions placed us in imbalance in our relationships with others. We need to identify which dominant trait followed our addiction or more than one: victim, controller, or isolator behaviors. The purpose for this is that these patterns need to be recognized and addressed for freedom from addictions to take root. By recognizing this trait, we continue to build unconditional relationships with others while working the steps. I have seen hundreds of people share their first step, and at the end they experience a release that allows them the freedom to continue another path. First steps are usually written in an autobiographical manner and include sharing the personal experience which led to the patterns of loss and control they had with the substance, and then the unmanageability of their life which followed. The authors of this book have created a website with downloadable worksheets especially designed to address the 3 patterns of behavior that people develop in their addictions. It can be found at www.treatmentguide4u.com. That is www.treatmentguide4u.com. After writing out the first steps with guidance from a sponsor or a counselor, the best thing to do is to present the information to your sponsor, family members, or group. Treatment groups that are 12-step based will usually have the person present their first step on their substance abuse as part of their treatment program. What this whole process does is to help break through some of the denial that is still in our life and bring into context how much it damaged our personal relationships with others. As a result of the information shared with others is placed in the forefront of our mind literally. The awareness of the problem comes to the surface in the present. Our conscious experience as making decisions is made in the cerebral cortex, in the frontal lobe of the brain. This literally brings the information to the forefront of our minds. What this does is making the information in our consciousness known as a priority in our immediate goals and expectations of our behavior. Addictions are part of a compulsive action. It no longer takes a conscious decision to act on our addictions. We are accustomed to our actions and we become less aware of them. That is part of being in a rut or cycle that has been going on for a long time. This automatic reaction to acting out on our addictions also blocks our internal value system to evaluate our actions. We go on an automatic pilot following a path that brings us back in a full circle. I remember meditating in front of a candle I had gotten for a gift. The outer layer of the candle appeared to be a woven framework around the wick, forming a globe around it, and leaving a small opening to see the flickering light. I sat calmly and observed the candle, and I began to interpret the candle being like an addiction. If my addiction was like the candle, my addiction would be reflecting my spiritual light and magnifying it. And as I put more resources into my addiction, like the outer layer of the candle, it would continue to grow around the inner light. When there was no more oxygen left, it would snuff out the light within. We interpret that addiction is creating positive energy in our life, like the reflecting light of a candle. We continue to use more substances and give more power to the addiction. Because we are giving it other resources in our life, it begins to grow, surrounding us slowly. Addiction uses up our resources until it extinguishes the light within us. The self-disclosure of sharing a first step with others in recovery is the key in laying the building blocks of a new lifestyle without addiction. This demands honesty about our circumstances of our addiction and sharing it with others. This subsequently helps to gain self-acceptance of our actions and paves the way for personal accountability. Through our collective experience in working the first step with others, we feel comfort in being released from the isolation of our addiction. By sharing with others who have suffered from their addictions, we hear our story portrayed in their experience. We hear at meetings, "I can't, but we can." I had a client who was involved in counseling with me continue for 1 year of individual sessions as part of their aftercare plan. He went over his first step with me, which he originally had done the first couple of months in his recovery. His denial had subsided where he could see more clearly after a long period of recovery. Because addictions are a chronic disease, they have the ability to go into remission, offering the individual a daily reprieve from their compulsion. Because of the power addiction has in our lives, it may weave through other back doors. A person may have been addicted to alcohol and then, because of his chronic pain, slip back into addiction through his use of narcotics. Or a person may switch into a behavioral addiction such as sex addiction or gambling addiction. Anytime I begin to use something to change how I feel, I should review it with the first step. The 12-step program is an individual's insurance policy to keep them from going back down the road into another type of addiction or relapse into their old ones. The challenges in the road to recovery we walk can be difficult at times. The pain of living can occur long after we stopped using, due to the circumstances that were either the aftermath of our addictions and lost relationships, or due to the pain that is derived from other natural resources that is part of our sober living experience. These life experiences may seem to bring chaos back into our lives. We may find ourselves acting out on compulsions that we had not encountered as part of the problem in the past. Fear is the basis for most of our character defects, which triggers us into further victim and controller patterns in our lives. Yes, addictions were a symptom of the problem that blocked us from successful, meaningful relationships with others. The underlying factors that contributed to our addictions haven't left us just because we stopped using, but may remain in remission by working the 12 steps. Using the first step at times in coming to terms with ongoing life experience causes us to return for further inventory of our lives. Recovery is known as the gift you have to work for. Through our continued experience in building relationships with others in recovery, we meet the challenges that come up on a daily basis. We are now ready to move on to step 2.